Hi everyone, my name is Patrick Curran, and along with Greg Hancock, we make up Quantitude. We're a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In today's episode, we present our very first interview. Our guest is Don Hedeker, who is a professor of biostatistics at the University of Chicago. In addition to talking to Don about research and rock and roll, we talk about getting scooped, day jobs, the Brady Bunch, German parents, midlife crises, beer salesmen, putting a nail through a fish, the Ramones, and getting caught sneaking into parts of a hotel we're not otherwise allowed. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Well, believe it or not, we are back again. Still can't believe it. Last episode was about grad advice, and how you doing, by the way? I'm just talking.
No. Well, one of the grad advice is be sure to let your advisor finish their sentences. So go ahead.
Okay. Anyway, I was just so excited about the last episode that we had with all the grad advice. You know, one thing that we've been doing for all these episodes is we've been giving people ways to contact us, as if people would actually want to contact us, right? We've got our Twitter handle at Quantitude Pod. And in fact, people are starting to tweet stuff, which is weird. We have the email thing, we have the voicemail thing. So things are happening. It's very cool.
They are indeed. So listeners, we do a little bit of divide and conquer, and Greg is more the social media guy, and so he sends the twits or whatever they are. I'm not I have no idea. He doesn't let me touch any of that. But I oversee the email. If you go to our website, quantitudethepodcast.org, at the bottom is a little dialogue box that you can submit suggestions for shows or comments or things like that. And we appreciate everybody who's sent things in. Some are less appropriate than others, and so we know who you are out there. But we got a recent one that I wanted to share. This came in just a couple of days ago.
A good one? We got one?
We got a good one.
Oh, okay.
Although it's a bit of an emotional roller coaster.
Okay.
So my mother has come up more times than a typical mom does in a typical podcast. And so I started reading this and I'm like, I can send this to my mom to show her that I actually am contributing to the world in some small way. And so here's what I got. Your podcast is a godsend. I'm sure as you're just starting out with the podcast, you're wondering if anyone is listening and if it is making a difference. You are. At our clinic for treatment-resistant insomnia, we have patients who simply cannot fall asleep despite trying all of our empirically supported treatments. I am pleased to report that listening to your podcast has changed their lives. Even if they wake up in the middle of the night, a small dose of your discussion on latent growth curve power is all they need. Thanks, guys. You're making a difference.
All right. Excellent. It's good to know.
So maybe that won't go to mom.
That's phenomenal. All right. Well, so I think no one is going to be able to accuse us of putting people to sleep with today's episode, because we have managed to. We mentioned this early in the very first episode that one of the things we were going to try to do was talk to people who actually know stuff, and today is going to be an episode where we talk to someone. Not only someone who knows stuff, but someone who's actually going to keep listeners awake, I'm pretty sure. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Patrick?
I do. In the accusation that we are a universal cure for insomnia, we're going to come out swinging. Because today we get to interview a rock star. And I don't mean that figuratively, I mean it literally, is we have a discussion with Don Hedeker. Don is a professor of biostatistics. He's in the Department of Public Health Sciences at the University of Chicago. He is not only a titan in the field, but he's just a seriously cool guy who is a major player in the Chicago rock scene. And this comes up in the interview. I defy anyone to sleep through Don. So we are very excited to share this with you.
Hope you enjoyed as much as we did. We are coming to you live from the Baltimore Inner Harbor. Are we at the Inner Harbor one? We're the Baltimore Marriott Inner Harbor at Camden Yards. We are doing our first remote broadcast, one where Patrick and I actually get to look at each other in the face rather than over Zoom. We get to make live faces at each other. And what's special about this is that we're at the conference of Society of Multivariate Experimental Psychologists, or Psychology.
Yes.
Okay, good. And we have our first in-the-flesh guest today, who is Don Hedeker.
So Don, do us a favor, just start out, where are you, your position, but then what we'd love to hear just as an icebreaker is, how'd you get to where you are today?
Yeah, it's been a crazy trip. Right now I'm a professor of biostatistics at University of Chicago in the Department of Public Health Sciences. I've been there for 5 years. Prior to that, I spent over 20 years at University of Illinois, Chicago, also in biostatistics, School of Public Health there. But I actually got trained in quantitative psychology from University of Chicago, and how that kind of developed was like this. I went to University of Chicago as an undergraduate. I'm from Chicago. I've lived my entire life in Chicago, not even in the suburbs, always in the city. And after graduating, since I've been a teenager, I've been in rock and roll bands. So I've been playing in bands. And so after graduating from college, I was hoping that my band would take off, and I was playing in bands. But I got a job working as a data analyst at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago. I had taken a bunch of stat classes as an undergraduate, and so I could run regressions, do t-tests, that kind of thing. There's where I met Robert Gibbons, who was just graduated with a PhD from U of C in quant psych under Darrell Bach, and he told me about this fellowship program that they had. Well, I wasn't thinking about going back to grad school yet. I was still hoping my music career would take off. I wanted to be a rock star after all. But I thought, well, I'll apply to this program. If I get it, I'll go. And so that's what happened. I spent 1 year working as a data analyst at Rush, and then the next year I was back at University of Chicago, but in quantitative psychology, studying under Darrell Bach. And so I did that, and I was at that time also working for Robert Gibbons, and so they were kind of like my two co-mentors through the 80s. I finally finished up in 89. For a while I wasn't sure if I was going to finish my degree. I mean, because I'd done my coursework, I took the prelim exams, all that, but I was working pretty much full-time for Robert, and I just couldn't even think of what can I do for a dissertation. And at that time, Darrell certainly was not one to spoon feed you. It was basically up to you to come up to his level or as close to his level as you could get. So I had no idea basically about what to do. But eventually I worked on mixed models with autocorrelated errors. And how I got into that was they had Laird and Ware, Darrell and other people, Bryken Raubenbush, had developed multi-level mixed models in the 80s, but they had assumed that the errors were independent. And I had taken time series classes. I thought, well, maybe the errors aren't independent. Maybe they're correlated to some degree. So why don't I put in AR1 errors into the model? And so I wrote that up, programmed it, and that was my dissertation, which I completed in February 1989. The reason I say the month is that next month, March 89, in JASA, was an article, Mixed Models with Autocorrelated Errors. So my first reaction was, thank God I graduated last month. Right. My second reaction was, oh crap, I spent all this time, now I can't, what am I going to do now? I got scooped, I got completely scooped. So it took a while, but I then developed methodology for ordinal outcomes, and that's what I then subsequently published in 1994 in Biometrics, and then also had developed programs, statistical programs to do mixed models, both for categorical outcomes, continuous outcomes, because really that was always, being a data analyst throughout the 80s when I was working for Robert, I came to realize, you want to develop methodology that people can use. Otherwise, what's the point? So writing the software back then, but this was prior to Proc Mixed or whatever kinds of mixed model software you use these days. M Plus was before M Plus. We wrote, myself and Robert, we wrote the code. We put that out as a freeware program and tried to disseminate this methodology, especially in psychiatry where I had been working. People continued to use analysis of variance for repeated measures. They just love that stuff. But the problem with it, of course, is because if you have missing data or you have correlated structures that don't follow compound symmetry, those methods aren't so helpful. So anyway, that's what kind of led to that. Then what led me to biostatistics? So I 89. I had a degree in quant psych. I'm still playing in a different band, but in a band. And I wanted to stay in Chicago because I had a lot of connections. I knew the people in the clubs and stuff like that. And I thought moving somewhere else, I'm going to have to start that all over. So I really wanted to stay in Chicago, mostly for my musical reasons. I didn't get a job actually till 92 in School of Public Health. It was in biostatistics. And so I had to kind of convince them that I was a biostatistician, even though I wasn't trained as a biostatistician. But it wasn't really that much of a stretch because most of my collaborations had been in mental health, in psychiatry. I worked on longitudinal data analysis. That's, of course, something that's useful in biostatistics. And really, I have to say my training in quant psych was very, very useful because I always say this, statisticians used to look down their nose at latent variable models, right? That's not really statistics. But you can't measure IQ, personality with a blood draw. It's impossible. You have to measure it with latent variables. And over time, I think biostatisticians have come to realize latent variable modeling is very important. And so having that background from quant psych was very useful. I think the only area I didn't really have too much training in that my biostat peers did was like in stuff like survival analysis, let's say, because that's a fundamental methodology in biostatistics and in medical studies that I had really not been so exposed to. But if you've been exposed to all these other kinds of models, it's not so hard to pick something like that up. And actually, I came to that in an interesting way as well. Here's another kind of interesting story. So after I published that ordinal model, mixed model thing, I had a colleague from sociology, Dick Campbell, and he says to me, your ordinal model, it's like a survival model. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? And then looking into it, and if you think about it, a survival model is truly an ordinal outcome, because did they die, the first month, the second month, the third, the fourth, whatever. The only thing that you don't have is there's right censoring, right, that occurs. And so I did a little bit of research into these event history models, as they're called in social sciences. And sure enough, there's a big connection between survival models and ordinal models. Worked on a paper in that regard, and thanks to Dick Campbell's suggestion, it took about a year to work on that, but I figured it out. But at that point, I just remember thinking like, wow, this is so cool. And I put that into the Mixor program, that ability. And I figured, my Mixor program, this program can estimate models for longitudinal ordinal data. It can estimate models for clustered survival data. It can do IRT models. And then it started to click to me, these are all just variants of what we now know as generalized linear mixed models, right? There's this, before I kind of thought of these things as different sorts of models, but they're all just slight variants of the same family of models. So that was kind of cool. Another thing I would say that really helped me out early days was having written those programs and making them available. When you do that, you have no idea how differently and creatively, let's say, people will use the programs, right? And so I would invariably get emails. I tried to run this model, blah, 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 your program doesn't work. So the next thing I would email back and say, well, how much did you pay for the program? And they'd say, well, it's free. I said, well, you expect it to work? Come on.
Now, I'm going to interrupt briefly.
Yeah, sorry.
I was one of those people who emailed you, and you have no memory of this because it was 25 years ago. I'm just a few years behind you, and I was doing my grad work in the early 90s, and we were starting to do growth models with adolescent substance use data that had these piling up at zero, and so it was like a zero inflated Poisson.
Yeah.
And so the details are not important, but I was one of those. And actually, you and I had a wonderful exchange about it. you helped us use this in the paper that we did. So
very
you
cool.
can teleport back, 25 years, and I was one of those guys.
Well, that's great. But I mean, that kind of interaction was so helpful for me to better understand these models, because people would use them in ways that I had not thought about. And like the one you mentioned, I remember also there was somebody who was doing a study of a dichotomous outcome across multiple waves. It was cocaine outcome, yes, no, basically. And the program wasn't working. And so send me your data. Back those days, people could send me data. I could investigate what's going wrong. Well, it turned out that in that particular study, they had 3 time points. They had a dichotomous outcome. Like 80% of the subjects had the same response across all 3 time points, either 1, 1, 1 or 0, 0, 0. And so I came to realize, especially with a dichotomous outcome, you might think you have longitudinal data, but for a certain proportion of the subjects, it's not really longitudinal, it's a constant. And so I built into the program, it then figured out, well, of all the subjects, what percentage of the subjects are constant. And so stuff like that happened. Another good example was somebody was modeling a random intercept in time model. And for their time variable, it was like, it started from 100 and went to 120. And the model wasn't working. Well, why wasn't it working? Well, the intercept variance that you're trying to estimate was 0. When time is 0, the data are here. They're way away from that parameter. And so once I subtracted off 100 and went from 0 to 20, boom, works like that. So there were situations like that really helped me understand much better how to do this kind of modeling, and really and I try to pass this on, especially to the students. Think about your variables, the scaling of the variables. This is all important, because you can't properly interpret your parameters if you don't know the scaling of the variables. So that was very helpful in those days, writing those programs.
So 60 seconds or less, what are you working on right now?
Right. So really in the 60 seconds, I'll talk fast. No, so what I've been doing more recently is developing models that have random effects in the error variance. So, and this is mostly for what's called intensive longitudinal data. So let's say you've got 30, 40 measurements within a subject. And what drew me to these models was my collaborations. I've been working in the area of smoking for a long time with smoking researchers. They would tell me, well, one reason people say they smoke cigarettes is to regulate their mood. And I would think, well, regulation of mood isn't necessarily about better mood, it's about more consistency in the mood. Well, that's the variance. And when I have, say, 5 time points per subject, I can't really estimate the variance per subject that well. If I have 50, I can. So with EMA data, the ecological momentary assessment, when I started getting into these kinds of data, I came to realize, well, let me try that idea out. Let me see if I use a covariate to influence the error variance, and then additionally put a random effect on it, because it's the same thing with the mean model. The covariates don't explain all of the reasons that there's correlation in the data. The residuals are likewise correlated within individuals. The random effect will account for that while I estimate the covariate effects. And so I've been developing these kinds of models that have what are called location random effects, the usual random effects in the mean model, and scale random effects, which have random subject effects in the error variance modeling. And so that's been a lot of fun to look at questions of variability as well as the mean structure, and to try it out with different kinds of data sets and different domains. One collaboration I had was with a sleep researcher. They had developed some kind of program to help people that were suffering from insomnia. Well, they had daily data basically on the amount that they slept. Well, they had looked at, does their intervention help them achieve a better mean? And they had published that. Well, we also then looked at the variance. Is it the case that the intervention is helping them achieve, say, 8 hours of sleep more consistently? And sure enough, there was a strong effect on the variance as well as the mean. And so this was additionally kind of interesting. And so I think it opens up the kinds of questions that one can look at a lot more. And so that's what I'm excited about these days.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of really rich questions in variance that get overlooked. We get so focused on the mean. There was a news thing a couple of months ago, I think, that was using, it might have been Fitbit data. People wear their Fitbit to sleep, and then it can tell when you go to sleep, right? But it was variability in not how much sleep you get, but the time at which you go to bed, and how consistent you are with regard to that. And that became an interesting outcome, as well as predictor of other health-related outcomes.
Right. Yeah. Another, you mentioned that. It reminds me of this other study we worked on. Was we looked at the time until the first cigarette. And sure enough, people who are more experienced smokers, on average, they have a cigarette earlier. So that's the mean effect. But it's also, they have it more consistently earlier. Mm-hmm. So it's an effect on the variance as well. And that was kind of interesting because it was more like a survival outcome. It was time until the event. And so we published this kind of paper for that kind of outcome as well. So we've extended it for continuous outcomes, for ordinal outcomes, and also for time to event outcomes. We're now looking if we can go for other kinds of outcomes as well.
Well, you know what I find so interesting? So I did not train as a quantitative PhD. I was a clinical psychologist and came to it later. And one thing that it took me years to figure out, and I think this is still an issue with the field, is I thought we were modeling variance. Because what are the two things you learn? Analysis of variance.
Right.
Which it took me 2 years to figure out we're comparing means. But then when you get your head around that, we slap students again with what is the multiple R squared? How much variance are you explaining? Is there a reduction in variance? What is the F test for the R squared change? And all you're doing is shifting a conditional mean. And so I think a big part of that is on us when we talk about analyzing variance. We're not. We're analyzing mean differences with respect to variance.
Yeah, no, that's excellent points. Exactly. It's the same thing with the between subject variance, right? In a multi-level model, the between subject variance is the variability of the subject means.
Right.
Basically, how spread out are those things? But yeah, it's not necessarily, it's not like the residual variance, which is really, within a subject, how much are they variable, how much are they consistent, how inconsistent they are. So along those lines, in doing this kind of modeling, I've tried to use different terminology to describe between subject variance and within subject variance. And so for between subject variance, talk of things like homogeneity, heterogeneity across subjects. With the within subject variance, it's about consistency, erraticism within subjects. So try to separate the language, because I think you're right. When we conflate the language, things just get very confused and doesn't really help things. So, but mathematically, it doesn't matter. Right. Mm-hmm. That's another thing that I always try to in writing papers, and is try to think of how I can make this as clear as I can to a person that's maybe trained, at a master's level or even lower than that in terms of statistics, and that takes work. This is one thing I with my students. I always they have this idea that I just go and I write the paper and then send it off and it gets accepted. Right? It's not like that at all. Not like that at all. I mean, the critical. A very critical skill is editing, is to go after you've written the paper, go back, edit, re-edit, and try to, make it as clear as you can. Then you send it out. I still have this. I have a review. I published a paper in JCCP, Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, in 1994. It was basically, back then, mixed models were still not that commonly applied. It was a paper kind of showing that, well, if we have data of students within classrooms and schools and we ignore that clustering, we get a lot of things significant. If we analyze at the aggregate level, take the classroom averages, we get a different story. And if we do the multi-level analysis, we get the right thing. That was basically the crux of the paper. Well, when I sent it to JCCP, there was 2 reviews. One was reasonable. The other one was a scathing review. They were like, why do we need this paper in 1994? These methods have been around, da-da-da-da-da. So I show this review to my students because they have this notion that I get always good reviews. Well, no, all of us get bad reviews, you're right? It's not really about the rejection. It's how you react to rejection, because everybody gets rejected, be it grants, be it papers, whatever. It's, I think of it like, you get knocked down to the floor. Are you going to get up or not? And that's the ability that you really need to develop, is to get that thick skin. Okay, you put the review away in your office for a while. You're mad as can be. 1 week later, you take it out or something like that. You look it over again and you say, okay,
I guess.
Yeah, I guess I'll do it. Right. But you have to do that, because it's just inevitable to get the rejection. It's really how you react to that. Because I do also know some colleagues who don't react to it too well, and it doesn't work out well. It's a good skill to develop it to try to react to it in a positive way. And again, even there too, I think sometimes when the easy thing to say, this is with grants too, is like, oh, they didn't understand what we were doing here. This is a terrible review. It's like, well, maybe the reason they don't understand it is because you didn't explain it well. you got to take some ownership of the fact if they don't understand it, it's not all their fault. It's like, maybe think about, well, why didn't they understand it? Try to make it clearer, basically, because there's no point in arguing with them. They don't understand it. It's on you to try to help them to get over that.
I like that you've been interweaving a lot of advice for students. I was curious what you think our field, and I don't necessarily, whether it's what we teach our students or what we're researching, where do you think we ought to be in a few years from now? Sometimes to me it feels like we're, in many respects, sort of in a place that we've been for a long time. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Well, it changes, but it changes maybe slow, not as fast sometimes. Yeah. I mean, what's come upon big time last 5-10 years is machine learning, data science, all of that. And to me, it reminds me a little bit of like when I was in graduate school in the 80s, literal and structural equation models were all the rage, right? And everybody was using them. And of course, they have stuck around because they are useful methods. And likewise, I think with machine learning, some of that is going to for sure stick around, but certainly there's sort of a faddish element to it. Mm-hmm. But I think it's useful for the students to learn about this new methodology. But also, you don't want to throw away, some of the old stuff as well. One time I was at a conference and somebody made this recommendation. Why don't once in a while you should just go to the library, get an old copy of Psychometrica or Biometrics or JES or whatever journal that you read. Go get one from the 1930s. Look at those articles and maybe read one of them, and you'll find that the thinking there could relate to something that you're doing. Mm-hmm. It's not like we've completely replaced statistical thinking or quantitative thinking. That's been around forever. And in some ways, years ago, they had to do it in a more efficient manner because they didn't have the computational tools that we have these days. So I think that's another element to go. It's good to be moving science forward, of course, and we want to do this. But sometimes it's interesting to go back and to see, even today, Niall presented that article from the 1898 or whatever it was, and this person had data and they were trying to basically come up with groups. It was sort of like a growth mixture model, basically, right? In 1898.
Patrick leaned over and said that exact thing to me during the talk.
Yeah. So we're at this conference and we all sit around, and Greg and I mostly sit next to each other and are like 7th grade boys in the back of the class, texting each other, taking pictures of people across from us and then modifying it with pencil markings and then texting it to other people. And so, yes, as he was talking about these data from 1898, and we were talking that it was the first latent mixture model.
Right.
Because they had 3 kinds of kids, based on, and it looked like it was kind of a tertiary split, on what the number line was. Yeah, I totally agree. I'm teaching an undergrad class in quantitative psychology, and we actually read students' 1908 paper. Yeah. Now, it's a lift. It's interesting to see. The math in that is insane.
Is it? Okay.
But the first third of it is one of the most clearly written, colloquial, laying out. And what he does is he tips a hat to Carl Pearson that if you get enough observations, then your estimates will resolve to the population parameter. But in this very folksy colloquialism, he says, however, we are not all in a position where we can assume that these population conditions hold, and he goes into the t-test.
Oh, man.
It's really neat to see.
That's cool. Yeah. I think that's another skill to really develop is the writing skill. I mean, I remember I was an undergraduate at University of Chicago, and I was an econ undergraduate because coming out of high school, I'm like, I don't know what any of these fields are. But I liked math, and I liked social science problems, so I thought, econ. And I remember being in the library and picking up a book by Milton Friedman. I thought, I'll never be able to understand any of this because, he's way up here. I'm this lowly undergraduate. And I was able to follow. And the reason I was able to follow because he wrote in such a clear and understandable way. And Fisher is like that as well. If you read his articles, it's one reason these people are successful is they're able to explain things to a wide audience and in a very clear way. And again, this is not something that one's born with. This is something that one can work at. And I've certainly did that because I know when I began, and many of us I think are probably like this, I got into quant methods because I like doing statistical analyses. I like data. I like playing with data. I really didn't like writing that much. But of course, to succeed in academics, one has to write. So it's something that I worked at and tried to improve upon all the time is to do a better job of writing the report, writing things out. But it's not something that I enjoyed initially, but I came to appreciate it.
So for somebody listening who is learning how to write, how do you learn that skill?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one way to do it is, if you can, is to share whatever you've written with colleagues, get feedback from them. That's certainly one way, because you might think it's very clear and they don't, and then you'll learn where you can improve things. Of course, everybody's busy. Who's got time? But I think that's one way for sure to do it. Another way to do it is again, you write the paper. And then you put it in your desk for like a week or two, sometime. Then you go back to it, because the time when you go back to it, you'll be like, you'll come to it with a new set of eyes, basically. And so that can also be helpful. The worst thing you can do is to rush a paper together and then send it away, because it's not a race. It's about when you do submit it, you want it to be the best it can possibly be.
Except if you get scooped a month later.
Yeah, right. That's right. Well, there is that element.
Yeah, right.
The funny thing about that story too, to end on that. So because of that, I turned to ordinal, because binary had been done at that point, but ordinal had not yet been done. And actually, in my dissertation, Peter McCullough was on my dissertation committee, so I had a chapter on ordinal mixed models. So I had derived the solution, but I had not programmed it. So then I worked on programming it. So anyway, it gets published in '94. Then there's an article that came out in a different journal, Tutz and somebody else, two German statisticians, and it was on ordinal mixed models. So I looked at that, and at the very end, they had like an editor's note. This paper came in prior to Hedeker and Gibbons being published. Right. So I always wanted to get in touch with those people and say, look, the reason I scooped you is because I got scooped. I was just passing it along.
Your turn.
Right. It was kind of weird.
Well, we have a lot of questions that we could choose from to bother you with. Patrick, I don't know if you have anything professional or if we should turn to bug him about non-professional or unprofessional things.
Well, maybe one, you've already addressed it, and you've given this a lot of thought, and this is part of, kind of how you are professionally. But, for, again, people who are like quant, they like data. I think all of us got in this because we like playing with data.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So there's somebody who's in their graduate studies choosing to go to grad studies, wherever they are in an earlier career. I mean, what are some just very specific recommendations you have in, the three of us, we all entered an academic world that is very, very different then than it is now. I mean, what do you tell your students, and what would you have told a younger Don Hedeker if you could teleport back to the rock band?
I would have told him what my mom always told me: keep the day job. That's what she told me, and that was very good advice. But I think the thing is, what's interesting, I think, with quant psych is it's really, I think it's doing pretty darn good right now relative. When I got out in '89, it was kind of more in what they were looking for were, in terms of psychology departments, wanted stat people like myself to teach the stat courses, but they were not giving PhDs in quantitative methods or methodology or stuff like that. So I came to realize if I go in that area, then I'm just going to be on everybody's dissertation, and I'm just going to be, it's a total service kind of job. And I wanted to mentor students. So for me, that didn't seem quite so appealing. That's the thing I think to look for in terms of when you're looking for a job is I don't know when I would have taken any job practically. So it's like you're just finished. You want, but you try to figure out the parameters of what it's going to be that you're going to be actually doing. How many courses are you going to teach? Are you going to be able to mentor PhD students? Do you want to do that or not? Are you going to just be providing service to the department? Things like that. These days, I think there's more to choose from. Of course, it all being on the internet and everything like that. There's a lot of people also with eyes looking at things. Back in the early days, it was some of it was word of mouth, or this person knew that person, or you'd see it in Amstat News, a job posting, things like that. I think these days it's a little bit more things move more quickly. And in terms of like going to a graduate program, I think if you're considering going for a PhD, you want to go to a program and align yourself with people who are doing things that you're interested in. I mean, where I'm at now, University of Chicago, we have a small department. We're public health sciences, so we have biostat, epi, and health services research. We only admit one student in each of those areas, more or less, each year. So we don't have a large PhD program. And so what we're always looking for is students that align themselves with what we're doing. Because there's no point in admitting, a student that wants to do work in some statistical or biostatistical method that we don't know much about. So, I mean, when I went to graduate school, I just went, oh, it's University of Chicago. Robert says Daryl Bach's really great. What do I know? I mean, I remember meeting him for the first time, and he was just like, oh, you have to immerse yourself in this. And at that time I was still playing in the band and thinking like that's really what I was excited about that. I'm not so sure I want to immerse myself in this or not. He was kind of right. I mean, eventually I did get to that point of immersion, but it took a little while. I mean, I guess that's the other thing I would mention with regard to quality of life issues or whatever. It's great to be in academics. There's a lot of, you've got your own schedule to some extent. You do things you're interested in. It's good to have outside interests as well, and to keep those things going. I mean, I see some people that are so focused in the science, and that's great. But one way I think about it too is like, look, whatever we're working on these days, in 10, 20 years, they're going to be working on something else. Mm-hmm. It's like we're continuing the process. We're like a chain, a bead in this chain, and that's great and all. But for me at least, I like to have outside interests. I do music. That's my outside interest primarily, and I've kept that going. Because I was one of those, you guys are too young, but I was one of those kids that saw the Beatles on 1964 on the Ed Sullivan Show when I was 6 years old, and I was like, wow, it's like, I want to do that. And so I've kept that going throughout my life, and it's been a great foil, but also I will say this, it's improved my ability at teaching, at doing presentations, because I come to understand a little bit more how to entertain an audience. I mean, when you're giving a talk, there's an entertainment aspect to the talk. Mm-hmm. You're trying to entertain them intellectually, but you want to think about what are you presenting? I see some people who give presentations and there's like 20, the font's 12 point or something like that. Somebody in the back, they're never going to see that. You got to think about your presentation and make it, take out whatever's unnecessary. I sometimes think this, I tell my students this, if there's one idea you want the audience members to get out of your talk, what is that one idea? And make sure and you emphasize that idea as much as you can, because you can't expect people are going to understand, every single thing of your talk. What's the most important things that you want to communicate? Let's try to emphasize that. Even still, early days, I would go to conferences and I would study people who are doing presentations. Why is this person doing a presentation that I can understand? And why is this person doing a presentation that I can't understand? And again, this is not something that one's born with, but something that one can develop. Why is this person giving a presentation that everybody seems to understand? What is it about it? And you come to realize things like talking to the audience instead of looking at the slides. I mean, back in the old days, we had overheads, and I'd see people who were talking directly to the slides, not engaging the audience whatsoever. They're nervous. Everybody's nervous when you begin. But you have to try to develop those skills if you want to communicate effectively. And so, those are things I still, you go to a conference and you see some people that give a really good talk. It's like, what made it so good? And try to incorporate those ideas in your own work.
It's some people, it seems like they don't take the teaching and communication aspect as, they don't realize its value as much as possible. And I would say you have a history of not just developing the science, but also communicating it clearly in what you write, and then developing the software that people need to actually get their hands on it, because it doesn't do a lot of good if you only have if you only have the first one or the first two.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, throughout my career, I've always thought about this accessibility thing. And that's also why I've worked on some papers that were like the JCCP paper. Sure, that statistical methodology had been developed already. But there were a lot of people in psychology that were not using this methodology. Why? Because it wasn't as accessible. So writing those kind of translational papers, even when you go up for promotion, they may not be considered as important. I think that they're very important. If you can get a whole substantive area to start using methodology, some new methodology, that can be a tremendous thing. One thing I've focused on time and time again is not just development of the methods, but trying to make them more accessible to people who can actually benefit from their use. Yeah. I think a lot of times how I've seen that work is like even just on a one-on-one with a substantive researcher, if I could show them something that I can do with my new methods that they had not been able to do with more traditional, and then they'll get excited about this methodology and say like, wow, that's cool. So what that means though is that it's great you got to have good examples too. I mentioned earlier I did this work on survival analysis, mixed model survival analysis. Well, the methodology was reasonable. The example I had wasn't a great example. We were looking at smoking initiation in an adolescence population, and there just weren't any significant effects. It was really, the data set just did not tell much of a story. And so that is a paper, I had to go to 3 different journals to get that published and I don't think it was necessarily the methodology, because that was not bad, but the example, it just wasn't one that showed the benefit of this methodology. So that's another important thing, is to try to find to have data sets that really show off your methods. That can really help to sell the methodology, I think.
I really especially appreciate it when a real life problem is the impetus for the development of these methods, rather than I developed a method, now where are data somewhere, right? So
without a doubt, yeah.
So music has come up a little bit. Let's walk away a bit from the equations and optimization and tell us about your band.
Sure. My current band is called the Polkaholics, and we're now going to celebrate our 22nd anniversary in November. And again, I've been playing in bands since high school, basically, which goes back to the early 1970s, to date myself. But the Polkaholics came about because I was around 40 at that time, and I had a midlife crisis playing in rock bands. But instead of getting a toupee and a sports car, I decided to go the opposite way. I'm going to play old people's music. Why try to wear spandex and look like a 20-year-old? I'm going to try to look like a 60-year-old and play polka music. But how I got into polka was this. So my parents are from Germany, and I tell this story. I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and I didn't want to be on Hogan's Heroes. I wanted to be the Brady Bunch. I wanted to be American. I didn't want to be ethnic or anything like that. But across time, I came to realize you got to use what you got, and use it to your advantage. And so when I started getting into polka, I came to, in rock music back then, it was like if you're from LA or New York, those were the selling points. But if you're playing polka music, if you're from the Midwest, that trumps. You can't be a polka band from LA. Come on. I'm sorry. But from Chicago, that works. So we developed this band playing polka music, but in a rock and roll kind of way, so with guitar, bass, and drums. And really, the first time we did it, again, 22 years ago, I got together with 2 other guys, and we just were curious, can we even pull this off? And we had our first show, and it was like, man, this is such a blast. We got to keep doing this. And so we kept doing this, and it's just turned into this. For me, it's great because I know a lot of my musical friends that can't play in clubs anymore, because the deal is this: if you don't draw an audience, you're not going to be playing in any clubs, because they don't care what you sound like. What they care about is how much beer they sell. And this is another reason the Polkaholics work so great, because all the songs are about beer. So we sold a lot of beer, right? So that's why, we're not really musicians. We're just beer salesmen.
So in post-processing, we're going to slip in a Polkaholic song so that people can hear. Pick the song that we're going to do and give it a quick intro, and then sometime later we'll cut this in. So what do you think is an iconic Polkaholics song?
Well, probably off our first CD, our theme song, which is We Are the Polkaholics. It's actually the Pennsylvania Polka.
Ladies and gentlemen, the show has begun. We are the Polkaholics. We're the polka, it's second to none. We are the Polkaholics.
And so what we've done in several times is to take a classic song but change the words or change the approach. Another good example is there's a German folk song called Muss ich nennen, which is it's a slower song. It's also known as the Wooden Heart Polka. And Elvis actually recorded this because he was over in Germany as a GI. He came back and he recorded this song. But we don't do it as Muss ich nennen or the Wooden Heart Polka. I changed it to the Existentialist Polka. so that's kind of been kind of a fun thing. And in a way, it's not unlike the research. It's like you take two elements that haven't yet been combined, right? You take something from econometrics that they do in this way, and they haven't yet done it in, or you do it differently in the structural equation model or whatever. You see this, you put them together. What will this be? And that's how you create new art, new science. Really, is you take a fish, you put a nail through it or whatever, something like that.
So you heard it here first, folks.
It's the future.
Take a fish and put a nail through it, and you have a new form of art.
Right, exactly. Maybe not a great form, but a new form.
Yeah. So I had a string of questions that we could throw at you really quickly, and they allude to a variety of things. But actually, Patrick, you're just going to feed off this. You didn't know you were going to, but you're going to feed off this.
I did not.
You did not know this. Okay. The answer might have already been told. Beatles or Rolling Stones?
Yeah, so I'll say both. Here's the reason.
No.
Well, let me go through this.
Okay.
When I saw the Beatles in '64 when I was 6 years old. I was immediately a Beatles fan, and all through the Beatles' career in the '60s, I tried to get as many records of theirs as I could, and I was totally into the Beatles. The Stones were viewed at that point as like the bad boys, and because that was the marketing of the Rolling Stones. Their manager realized the Beatles are the good guys. Yeah. Well, let's market the bad boys. But then once the Beatles broke up and I got into high school, I got heavy into the Rolling Stones. And so I would say, ultimately, if I have to, it's an impossible choice. I would say my musical playing for sure is more influenced by the Rolling Stones and Keith Richards in particular. I mean, I listened to their albums and like their live album, Get Your Ya-Ya's Out. I've probably played that, thousands of times, trying to learn every single note, and lick on that and come up short, but still try. So I guess, but how do you compare the Beatles and the Rolling Stones? I mean, but I know younger people who say, oh, they're overrated. I say, write a song as good as the worst song by the Beatles. Come on. It's like, you can't do it. I'm sorry.
Right. Patrick, do you have a binary choice that you can just pull out like that?
Acoustic or electric?
I would say for me, electric. I have acoustic. I can play that around the house, but yeah, there's nothing like the sound of an electric guitar for me. It's and I have a old Gibson Les Paul Jr. It's got what's called a P90 pickup. It's a black pickup. It's got one pickup. It's got the greatest sound. For me, that's it. The Les Paul Jr. going through a Music Man amp or a Fender amp, something like that. That's the sound.
I don't know if this is fair, but let's go with Sex Pistols or Ramones.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's sort of like then gets to my college years. In the 76, 77, when punk rock was starting to happen, I was like, what's this punk rock? So I got a Sex Pistols record. It's like, wow, this is the greatest thing. So at that time, there was I went to the University of Chicago. They had a radio station, WHBK. And so I created a radio show called Anarchy in the UC. And so I'm playing that music. At that time, college radio isn't the way it became. They were trying to emulate essentially FM rock radio. Mm-hmm. So they were not about breaking new artists, local artists, stuff like the way it became more common. So they put me on from like 3 to 7 a.m., the middle of the night, because they wanted to bury me, right? So I didn't care. I wanted to play this music. And so I was on there. And then the next year, the person who became the program director, he really liked my show, so he gave me the Friday evening, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. slot, the great slot, right? And so I did that. And during that period of time, this is in May of 1980, the Ramones came to University of Chicago to play a concert, and I was in a band that was playing around campus. We got to open up for the Ramones. And so that was like, yeah, that was a great thrill. Interestingly enough, the one who talked to us was Johnny Ramone. Johnny was he was a relatively friendly guy. The others, it wasn't like they just didn't want to have anything to do with us, basically. They just wanted to do the gig or whatever. And another thing I remember from that show is after the show, Joey comes off, and he's like ready to collapse. I had no appreciation at that time how much energy singing takes, especially singing the Ramones, because they're like nonstop, and so it was very interesting. And the other interesting aspect of that concert was, so that was my senior year in college, May of 1980. We just opened up for the Ramones. I'm thinking the next day I'm going to be like the king of the year, right? I'm walking around. Nobody says anything to me. I'm a complete nobody. It was just like, it was a very, useful, and that's the way the music business is. You're up one day, you're down the next day. It's a roller coaster, but it was a great thrill. So, answer that question, Sex Pistols or here's another interesting tidbit. Okay, so it was that summer, I believe. So my college roommate, he lived in Long Island. I went out for a week, and we went every single night. We didn't stay in Long Island. We went to Manhattan. We went to CBGB's. We went to Max's. We went and we were in CBGB's. This would have been August of 1980, thereauts, or was it 79? It might have been 79. Anyway, we went to CBGB, see Richard Hell and the Voidoids, who walks into the audience, but this guy that looks like Sid Vicious. And back then there was no internet, so I was like, what's he doing here in New York? They're from England, And then and he walks in with Nancy Spungen, actually. Right. Then after that, there's this guy who walks in who's Jerry Nolan. Jerry Nolan was the drummer in the New York Dolls and the Heartbreakers, two bands that I really, really liked. So I knew it was him. Mm-hmm. So this Jerry Nolan, he's also with a woman, goes to talk to this guy that's Sid Vicious. And I'm like, well, there's got to be Sid Vicious then. And in fact, they were talking about, because they played some shows together around that time. But here's the saddest aspect of this entire encounter. That afternoon, I had gone to Bleeker's Bob's, which was a famous Greenwich Village record store, and I had gotten a 12-inch copy of My Way, the Sex Pistols' My Way, which Sid Vicious sings on. He's on the cover. And I had that with me at the time. And I was thinking, like, I should go up to this and get him to autograph it. And I was thinking, nah, he'll probably just break it or something like that. So I didn't do it. And he walked right by me. I could have had an autographed Sid Vicious My Way.
Or a broken
Sid Vicious. Either way, it would have been pretty cool. So that was my brush with fame on the Ramones side and the Sex Pistols side. We didn't play with the Sex Pistols, unfortunately. I don't know. Geez, that's a hard question. Who's better? I think the Sex Pistols were more revolutionary, I would say, in a sense. The Ramones were very important and very influential. They're both way up there, of course.
Good. That's nice. Patrick?
So in all the interviews that we do on the QPod.
Going back to the very beginning.
Going back to the original interview.
I can guarantee Sid Vicious was not mentioned.
Well, no, but if we think back to the very first interview we ever did on QPod, it was 51 minutes ago when we turned on the recorder, and here it is. So going back across all of the interviews, we wrap up with one question.
Okay.
All right. That is, well, first I want to clarify that this is completely plagiarized from a podcast I love called Make Me Smart with Kai Ryssdal, and they do this, and total plagiarism, right? But I learned legally that if you identify it as plagiarism, then you're not in trouble because you know it. Yeah, plagiarism is only a problem if you don't realize it. So
important
the question is, just remember that as a professional development. What is something that you thought you knew, but later you found out you were wrong?
So many things. In my career, it's like when things don't go the way I thought they would go, and you have to dig deeper and then try to understand. That's where I've really learned things. I'll give you an example. Like in my dissertation, I developed these mixed models for longitudinal data, and the data I said I used was a psychiatric data set published by Reesby from 70s, and they had done this very rudimentary analysis and found that what they were looking at was drug levels of antidepressants, were they related to depressive outcomes. And they had done like a Kendall's correlation, basically. They had longitudinal data, but they didn't know how to analyze longitudinal data then, so they just took the last time point, the depression level, the level of drug, they did a simple correlation, they got a significant p-value, I then did this mixed model with time-varying covariate of the drug level, time-varying outcome, and I got a significance of 0.06, right, a p-value. I'm like, what the heck is going on? I do this fancy work and I don't get a significant result. Well, what it came down to is that I was not modeling the relationship in the best way. What I came to learn is that you just plop a time-varying covariate into your model. What you're getting is essentially an average cross-sectional effect. It's like you did the analysis at these different time points, each one a separate regression, and then you average the result. Well, I came to realize that the relationship in this didn't work that way. There was sort of a lagged relationship. Once I did that, I got a highly significant result. So, I mean, the point I guess I'm going to make is that it was really when things didn't go the way I thought they were going to go that I learned so much, because it helped. It got me to really think about what I'm doing and what I might do instead. And if I would have got, in that first analysis, if I would have got 0.01 or 0.02, I would have never learned this stuff. It's those mistakes that really can teach you so much. So here's the other thing I would say is don't be afraid to make mistakes. Another thing, if I could impart upon the junior faculty, my very first presentation was at the Psychometric Society when I was a graduate student. So I wear a suit, tie, I get all dressed up. I give this talk about what basically mixed model longitudinal data, and somebody in the audience who I won't identify said, "Oh, well, that's very interesting," but the person was making this comment that my analysis was incorrect because I had not appropriately accounted for the missing data across time. So I was kind of blah, 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 blah. I didn't know what to say, right? I was completely shaken. I went off, and I was just devastated, basically. And I remember I then met that person like 2 years later at something else, and we were talking. I just said, "Oh, yeah, I remember you from the Psychometric Society." And he goes, "Oh, I don't remember you from that at all." And I thought, you completely ruined my life and you don't remember this? Right? What are you talking about? But then, that was another example of, getting rejection, but coming back from it and trying to. It's just the point I would make. Everybody gets rejected. I got rejected in so many ways, but the point is to try to come back from that.
Well, I would say easily you're the best guest we've ever had.
Yeah.
What do you think? Patrick?
This is unambiguous.
We need a vote? No vote? We don't even
No
need a
vote.
vote.
You are the best guest we have ever had on.
I know you've said that many times before.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
we have.
so it's a conditional. It's the best guest we've ever had in a room in a hotel where we're not supposed to be, where there's a high probability of being kicked out.
Yeah, so folks, we're not supposed to be here. We snuck in. I snuck in the first time and was discovered and escorted out. And Greg snuck in another door. And so we have been wondering this entire time if we were going to be able to wrap this up, and we have. And so on that point, as always, thank you for joining us. We hope you have enjoyed this even half as much as we have. This has been a wonderful time. Don, thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hey, Q-Potters. Be sure to tell your friends to check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they prefer to get their low-budget homebrewed podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @QuantitudePod, and visit our website, quantitudethepodcast.org, where you can leave us a text or voice message. Be nice. You've been listening to Quantitude, the podcast whose name is Latin for egregious error in judgment. Today's episode was sponsored by undergraduate note-taking, representing the increasingly offensive belief by professors that students should be active participants in their own education. By variable transformations to help achieve normality. Sure, that makes everything better. And by heteroskedasticity, the word whose proper pronunciation is accepted as a field sobriety test in 26 states. This is most definitely not NPR.